guys, and welcome to another video. So it's currently midnight, and I wanted to create a video for you guys based on something that we did that was rather well received from last week, a video that I wonderfully titled Random Lore. I still don't know if I'm going to name the series anything different, but so far Random Lore seems pretty apt. Again, I've got a list of random lore topics and discussion that I want to share with you guys, talk a little bit about the future of the franchise, Heart of Thorns, and beyond, even current events going on interior, like for example the magical chests that have appeared in the Black Lion Company, and the pet rock mini that we have, what perhaps influence they could have on the story, and just kind of talk through them with little segue, rhyme, or reason. So let me know what you think. A lot of people did enjoy it. It's a bizarre video for me because it's literally just me sat here talking about the story. But maybe I should come to terms with the fact that maybe that's just what people like. Alright, so enough preamble. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was something that really recently was brought to my attention. It's specifically not about Heart of Thorns. It's not about Guild Wars 2 of today. It's about Guild Wars 1. And it's in relation to character creation in Guild Wars 1. How could there possibly be interesting lore speculation here? Well, I got a message from someone that really did quite blow my mind, and this was the fact that when you entered character creation for the first game, and you were presented with your choice of choosing a profession, just as we are in Guild Wars 2, you would be given kind of a placeholder image of a character that represented that profession. And what was kind of cool about this fact is that if you, for example, chose to play as a necromancer, the little person that appeared on the icon for the necromancer was Eve. Eve, if you're a Guild Wars 2 pure player, you probably won't know about, but back in GW1, we kind of had another iconic group of adventuring travelers. Much like Destiny's Edge, much like Destiny's Edge 2.0, they were deliberately varied in their personalities and specifically their combat classes. It's kind of these characters can be the placeholders for the player character. Obviously, the player character was a million different things. Anyone who played Guild Wars 1 was the player character. They picked different names for themselves, different skin colors for themselves, different heritages for themselves, and they did different quests in different orders, and each had their own unique adventure. And so this has always presented a problem for the developers, specifically when it comes to retelling the story. How do you honor the original player character when there were so many different things? And that means that in Guild Wars 2, we don't really get much recognition for what we did. Perhaps some kind of a subtle grave outside, say, the Ascalon settlement, which speaks of an unknown hero. We can't really expect them to do too much more. This was a problem even in GW1, when players that finished Nightfall felt kind of slighted that Cormyr became the god, and they didn't. It was pretty much impossible for them to become the god, because then you'd have tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands different players that all became the god. It's a problem with MMOs that I don't really blame the devs for not having solved. So, ArenaNet came up with a solution, and the idea is to have specific characters in the story who are always the same, regardless of what you, the player, is playing, and these characters can be credited for the events of the games. If you guys have ever seen my lore series, retelling the events of Guild Wars 1, you'll notice that I don't really talk about the player character completing all of these events and unfolding the narrative. Instead, I talk about an adventuring band of heroes: Devonna, Aiden, Eve, Sin, and Menlo. These 5 characters were our original Destiny's Edge. Devonna, the warrior, was their leader. Aiden, the ranger, was the grizzled, old, wise character that offered advice but rather led from the backlines. Sin was the fiery, impassioned, and often aggressive and angry elementalist. Menlo was the peaceful monk who walked the line between both the teachings of Dwayna and the teachings of Balthazar, and in the end, fell in love with Sin. Lastly, we had Eve, who was kind of introduced a little bit later in the story, and definitely seemed like an afterthought to the devs, had far few quests related to her, but seemed kind of insane as she carried a skull around with her that she called Aiden. Perhaps had something to do with her necromantic ways. So to go back to the original point, when you created a profession in character creation for Guild Wars 1, what they would do is they would throw up a little image of one of these characters. If you chose to play a necromancer, you would see Eve there. Eve even appeared on some of the box art for the game, the physical box art. So here's the interesting thing. I just gave you guys 5 characters representing 5 professions for the original release of Prophecies. But some of you will already be thinking, hold on, wooden potatoes, there were 6 professions originally. There was also the idea of a mesmer. And it turns out that unlike in Guild Wars 2, where we had 5 playable races and a character representing each, in Guild Wars 1 we had 6 professions, but only 5 characters. The question is, Who was that Mesmer supposed to be? Eve herself seemed like an afterthought that was dropped in only very late, so the idea of having a Mesmer character too seems to have slipped by ArenaNet, and it was something they never thought of adding. But if they had added a Mesmer, who would that character have been? Well, maybe this is where the character creation screen comes in. If you pick a Mesmer, once again, like with the other professions, you also see an image. And this image is of a character we do know about in the story. That is an image of Althea. Althea is a character, unless you've listened to a lot of my lore-based speculation videos, you may not understand anything about, but Althea was a really integral character to the Ascalon storyline. She was betrothed to Prince Rurik. They say it was true love, but perhaps this was just an organized wedding that would allow Rurik, who is not technically of King Doric's blood and the royal bloodline, to marry back into the royal bloodline, as she was daughter to Lord Baradin, who was supposed to be the rightful king, and gave up that responsibility to Adalbern, who instead had the popularity vote in Ascalon because he had done so well in the Guild Wars. So it's this interesting story of Rurik marrying back into Althea to get royal blood back and legitimize the throne once again. But during the Searing, when the Char attacked, the story doesn't quite unfold that way. Instead of us getting to know Althea, a Mesmer, deeper and eventually joining the adventuring band along with Devonna and company, she instead is captured by Char, taken north of the wall, and tortured to death. And so that's where Althea's story ends. There is a couple of quests you can participate in Guild Wars 1 north of the wall, where Baradin, her father, who once gave up the throne to Adalbern, who was going mad, basically, and eventually exiled his own son. Baradin tells you, please find out what happened to my daughter. You find out she's dead, and you return Althea's ashes to Lord Baradin. So that's an interesting thought, that actually the sixth member potentially could have been, at one point, Lady Althea, who was a huge character in the story, and then, never really got the recognition that she could have eventually had because she was killed early. If that's not enough to convince you, you should also note that each time you picked to play one of these professions, you'd get different music in the background. If you picked the Mesmer, well, you'd get a track playing in the background called Althea's Theme. It's one of my favourite Ascalon-based storylines, and it's why my account name in Guild Wars 2 isn't woodenpotatoes.1234, it's Baradin. It's named after him and the story with Althea. There is one small thing to this theory of the character creation suggesting that the sixth member could have been a Mesmer and that would have been Althea, and that's the fact that not all of them honestly match up. I believe Devonna, the representative character for her, isn't even Devonna. It's just a generic warrior, and there's another instance of it not lining up too either. It's a pretty flimsy idea, but it's a fun one to me. And maybe that's why it's appearing in this video instead of a different one from me. Moving on, we're talking about Ascalon lore. Let's have a little bit of a look at Rytlock during Season 2 of The Living World, and specifically what happened there with Rytlock being dragged to the Mist. So a quick recap for those of you who haven't been following the story. There are two ancient and powerful Aurian artifacts in the hands of the Ascalonians, or there were. One was named Sahothin, a fiery sword with a dragon for a hilt, and the other was a twin sword named Magdea. King Adalbern, after having exiled his son from the nation of Ascalon, eventually leading him to his death on the Shiver Peaks, kind of fell into madness, and when the Char were about to capture the final area and win Ascalon back for themselves, Adalbern smote them. He used the power of Magdea, infused with what seems to be undead magic, perhaps not a coincidence because of the sleeping Zaitan beneath the city of Arar, where these swords originated from. Adalbern unleashes the Foe Fire. He nukes not only all the Char in the vicinity, but all of his own people too, and everyone affected by the Foe Fire returns as undying ghosts. Ghosts that the Char have been fighting for over 200 years now. It is this fight that the Char face against the Ascalonian ghosts, as well as the ogres from the Blaze Ridge Mountains, as well as the branded from the new scar cut into the land by Kraukatoric as he flew south, that the Char find themselves outnumbered on many levels and looked into basically having alliances with the other races and appreciating the power of the Norn and the Asura and the Silvari, and even, Smodin the Unflinching believes, their Imperator of the Iron Legion, the humans too, and this is one of the reasons why the treaty came about at all. And so the Char desperately want to end this Foe Fire. If they can put the ghosts to rest, perhaps they can focus on less threats and, muster more strength. Ritlock specifically tries to deal with this during Season 2 of The Living World. There is a legend we knew about long before Season 2 of The Living World, which states this, that if Magdea, one of the swords, as well as Sahothin, which Ritlock himself wields, are brought together in the hands of a rightful king, that the Foefire can finally be put to rest. Ritlock kind of ignores the last part of that ritual, and after reclaiming Magdea from Bagarth, a famed Norn smith who joins the Pact under Air's command and actually repairs Magdea after the events of Ascalon Catacombs, Ritlock in Season 2 attempts to reverse the Foefire. The ritual goes wrong, and he loses Sahothin to the Mists. What does he do at this point? Well, he's the badass Char that's everyone's favourite, right? So he jumps in after it, and he goes missing. It could be one of these kind of cool mysteries. Where does Ritlock resurface in Heart of Thorns? But of course, that has already been spoiled for us because of the betas. The one personal instance we get to play in the betas reveals Ritlock returning from the mist to us. I was a little bit disappointed in this, honestly, as a slight tangent. I was really hoping that Ritlock would reappear to us in the Temple of Balthazar, for example, that hopefully we'll get to explore in the Maguma jungle at some point. But we do know that he returns from the mist. And when he does, he has changed his class. He is no longer the warrior Ritlock Brimstone. He is the Revenant. And with him, he brings the ability to channel legends of the past. And so here's the theory. Here's the speculation about Heart of Thorns. The idea is that Ritlock can now channel heroes and great legends of the past, and perhaps Ritlock still can cure the Foefire. All he would have to do as a newly created Revenant is channel the power of Rurik himself, King Adalbern's son, the man who died on the northern Shiver Peaks at the hands of Dagnar Stonepate. He channels Rurik. Rurik, for example, may have a grudge against Adalbern and disagree with Adalbern's choice to release the Foefire. Rurik may also have to kowtow to Ritlock's influence because Ritlock, at the end of the day, owns Sahothin and Rurik doesn't. Ritlock is the Revenant, and Revenants seem to have some control over these legends that they channel, as we see, say, for example, with Revenants channeling Malix the Unyielding, a guy who probably wouldn't want to be in that position. And because of this, maybe the Foefire will be reversed in Heart of Thorns or shortly after, because Ritlock now has the power to channel Rurik himself. And now he does have that last bit of the ritual. He is the rightful king of Ascalon. He wields the swords, and he reverses the Foefire. That could be an interesting way to end Heart of Thorns and eventually lead us into the expansion Guild Wars 2 Cogs of War, or GW2 Cal. The last thing I want to talk about today is, again, to do with the future of the franchise and Heart of Thorns, and beyond specifically, and it's the idea of the Pact. So one thing that on a mechanical level, let's ignore story for a second, that I think Guild Wars 2 really could have taken advantage of, or that lacks as an MMO, especially in comparison to its predecessor and to its current competition, is the fact that there isn't much of a feeling of joining a faction. And I think faction-based identification and gameplay, identifying with a faction and, talking to other people out in the open world who are of the opposite faction, just having that kind of playful banter really does restrict Guild Wars 2. And it's one of these extra little things that causes us as players not to interact with one another so much. Any players of Guild Wars 1 will remember very fondly the thought of Kurzik players talking smack to Luxon players. And, in a playful way, any players of World of Warcraft will probably think of Alliance versus Horde. I think Guild Wars 2 lacks it, and the devs knew that this would be important for the game because they initially conceived of the orders, the Order of Whispers, the Vigil, and the Dermond Priory. But during the personal story, I believe, and I've always believed, that they made a huge mistake. They gave us these orders. We rushed through a couple of missions with them. I ended up achieving these stupidly high ranks in them. It never really felt like a great progression. It blinded by too fast. And then the three orders joined together to form the Pact under Traherne. I have always believed that the Pact has been a force for negative in terms of the mechanics of Guild Wars 2. I have always preferred the thought that the three factions would continue to have a lot of prominence. Now, in the story, they technically do, but really, in terms of the way that the story is told now, we're mostly just following the Pact. Heart of Thorns excites me for one big reason, and that's the fact that a large, huge assault force from the Pact, and most of its biggest heroes, Traherne, many members of Destiny's Edge, were brought down with it, and it was destroyed. And so now there's this idea that the Pact could break. Now, mechanically, I'm very much in favor of this idea. I like the thought that the Heart of Thorns story expresses a loss of hope for the Pact because of the destruction of the fleet. And, you know, things get wonky. Perhaps if Trahearne, their leader, the original Sylvari to be born, the most likely candidate for Morgemoth to want to corrupt, if Trahearne does fall to Morgemoth eventually, you know, the War Marshal of the Pact gets cut away. I like the thought of the Pact dissolving. I think it could put narratively and mechanically Guild Wars 2 into a far stronger place. So to indulge on that idea a little, I do want to talk about story implications of that. Let's say that the Pact is destroyed. What does that mean? Well, we would end up going back to a situation where we have the three orders, but the Pact accomplished a lot of stuff, created a lot of stuff. And I'm not just talking about the fleet that, yes, was destroyed by Morgemoth, but nonetheless was fairly powerful. I'm not just talking about the variety of airships they created, and specifically the glory of Tyria, this flagship that ended up destroying Zhaitan in a fairly Deus Ex Machina fashion, and then they ended up replicating lots of them, as we saw in the Silver Waste and the cutscene trailer for Heart of Thorns, and even Verdant Brink itself. I'm talking about some of the other things too. What about the Blue Orb? The Blue Orb was a strange artifact recovered from the crates, had its origins in the deep sea, and produced an aura around everything that existed inside it Zhaitan could not touch. The prevailing theory here with the Blue Orb is that it belongs to the Deep Sea Dragon, and this orb was used to establish Fort Trinity. Fort Trinity, a huge packed base connected by a surrogate to the main hubs of civilization far to the north on the edge of Straits of Devastation. This fort could only exist because of the power of the Blue Orb. We haven't heard about that since the personal story, and if the Pact were to be destroyed, whose hands does the Blue Orb fall to? That's not the only powerful artifact they have at their disposal. Let's think about the Smiths too. 3 renowned Smiths. Bagarth himself, who rebuilt Magda, who tapped into the secrets of Deljamor Steel. We have a Tengu and even Occam, a Sylvari, who created armor that basically made another Sylvari, the Green Knight, as you see in the early personal story, invincible and able to continuously resurrect himself. What happens to all of their creations? We've seen them in the beta so far, but should the Pact be destroyed, where would that go to? It gets worse, though, and specifically, the last thing I really want to talk to you guys about is the Cauldron of Cataclysm. If you're unsure what the Cauldron of Cataclysm is, many years ago, the Char, the Flame Legion specifically, found themselves gods. Gods in creatures that basically weren't gods. They were the Titans. They were incredibly powerful creatures, don't get me wrong. The Titans slaughtered the Massat. The Massat, only 3 of them had the power to destroy an entire invasion force of Char that had once assaulted Kryta. And the Char themselves, you know, had the power to destroy all of Ascalon and Or while they were at it. So the Titans, yes, were these very, very powerful creatures, byproduct of Abaddon from the Realm of Torment, but specifically what the Titans granted the Char and allowed them to attack Ascalon, breach and launch invasions on Or and on Kryta and all the human lands was the Titans gave the Char the Cauldron of Cataclysm. This is supposedly a relic from many years ago, created by creatures now since fallen into slumber. It basically seems that the Cauldron of Cataclysm is related to Elder Dragon power, and considering that when using the Cauldron of Cataclysm to bring down the Searing on Ascalon, the Char summoned great crystals that scorched the lands and destroyed homes, it seems very likely that the Cauldron of Cataclysm is somehow an artifact relating to the power of Kralkatorrik, a dragon also renowned for its likeness and its ability to control or manipulate or generate crystalline structures. So we have the Cauldron of Cataclysm, and at the end of the personal story, should you choose the Priory option, you'll find that another one has been found, and one was utilized against Zhaitan and the Risen in Or. This is actually a huge part of the story that I wish, if I could have rewrote the personal story for ArenaNet, if I could revamp it, there would be significant more focus on this fact. There was another Searing, guys. There wasn't just the Searing in Ascalon. Guild Wars 2's personal story showed us a Searing in Or. It was used specifically by the Pact against Zhaitan, and it wiped out a huge number of Zhaitan's forces, allowing the Pact to eventually push on to Arar and eventually defeat the dragon itself. We summoned a Searing on top of a land that had already been destroyed by a Vizier and raised back out of the sea in an undead form, had once had gods living on it. It's a pretty badass plot, right? But so now that the Pact's destroyed, where even would the Cauldron of Cataclysm go? It's kind of an interesting discussion because despite how powerful the Cauldron of Cataclysm seems to be, this wasn't the only one. We of course know of the one that was used to bring down the foe fire in the first place in Ascalon, and there have been 2 more examples you guys may not know about of Cauldrons of Cataclysm. One of them was seen in Guild Wars 1, or something that looked very similar to one, in the Desolation, a toxic, hazardous environment north of Elona and south of the Crystal Desert, currently unviewable on the game's playable map. And the final Cauldron of Cataclysm, in my opinion, the rarest one and the hardest one to think about, is actually just seen in Guild Wars 2 under the water, vaguely near Abaddon's sunken temple in the Straits of Devastation. It's seen near Broken Spit Waypoint. So we've seen a lot of these artifacts. The Pact has access to one, and should the Pact fall, as I'm very much hoping they would, it's kind of an interesting thought to think about all these vast resources they have now accrued. Where would they go? Would the blue orb fall back into the hands of the Lagos? I'm really not sure. And hopefully Heart of Thorns or the Living World seasons following it do touch on this kind of stuff. Anyway, there you go, guys. There's some lore discussion. Let me know if you enjoyed the video. These videos take so little prep for me. I just sit here and I talk about stuff that's on my mind. Hopefully you guys have fun. I'd love some discussion on the various things we've talked about here. Don't forget to check out the comments if you don't usually. And I guess I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everyone.